Welcome, everyone, to the next perfect step, where all possibilities lie in conversation. I'm your co host, Lori Mullen.
And I'm your co-host, Lori Tremblay. We welcome you and we're glad you're with us today. We have a very special returning guest with us, Helen Fernald, and she is going to talk to us today about her upcoming book, which is about her mother. And the book is called Love Helen, Letters to My Mother. Helen Fernald is a grief recovery mentor who teaches the process of therapeutic letter writing to help loved ones create peace and a renewed connection after loss. That's a lovely way to reconnect. Thank you and welcome back, Helen.
Thank you so much. First of all, thank you so much for having me back and for letting me talk about this part of my journey, which is very exciting because my book, with a little bit of luck, will be on Amazon in the middle of the month and then in local bookstores at the end of the month. So I'm very excited about that because this has been a 25-year journey. So it's really nice to see it coming to fruition finally. So I'm very excited about that and excited to talk about it. But I thought first, if it's okay with you, I would just start with a letter to my mother because I think that it will give people a little better idea of my own journey through grief and a reassurance to everyone that although we kind of tend to ignore grief in this country, grief is a very real thing. And it's very important that we actually deal with grief so that we can stay healthy. So this is a letter that I wrote recently to my mother, and it's called The Path to Healing. Dear Mom, when you died unexpectedly in 1992, I was heartbroken, not even sure I could continue. You were my rock, my strength when I was afraid. You offered hope in dark moments. I wasn't ready for you to leave. Suddenly I was an orphan, alone in a frightening world. I needed you, but you were not there anymore. How could I ever cope? Little by little, I began to retreat from the world. No one really noticed. I had the perfect excuse, a family to nurture. My cozy home offered the ideal hiding place. I still taught and volunteered, so no one ever guessed my secret. Gradually, my world became smaller and smaller. Driving at high speeds or in wide open spaces became daunting. Driving far from my little castle high up in Wolfboro, New Hampshire, seemed impossible. The world felt very dangerous. How many people must experience this after a sudden loss of a parent, child, lover, or friend? How terrifying does life become when we suddenly feel abandoned? Where do we turn? What fills that void? How do we anesthetize ourselves to that searing pain? After such a loss, many people blame themselves. If only they had done something differently. Clearly, they don't deserve happiness, they reason, or this never would have happened. If it happened once, surely it might happen again. Feeling that pain seems too horrific to even take a risk again. Far better to hide and numb oneself. What kind of a life, though, comes from hiding and numbing? The next question then is this. How do we find our way back to some semblance of happiness? What steps can we take to initiate our walk back into the world, to take control little by little of our lives? There are many tools available now: mindfulness, meditation, tapping, yoga, breath work, cognitive behavioral therapy, EMDR, among others. Perhaps the first step, though, is to open to self-compassion by honoring our humanness. Every emotion has value, even the ones that we prefer to avoid. Terrible things do happen, but recognizing that we have survived allows us to encounter a new strength within. A light deep buried begins to emerge. Maybe one day we will see why things played out as they did. Perhaps we will never know. Of importance, though, is recognizing that we are now free to move forward in our own lives. When we tap into our courage, we learn to feel a profound kind-heartedness for ourselves and others. Each person faces unique challenges, but the underlying fears are similar. Taking small steps to unlock our hearts, we comprehend that others are seeking the same light. Gradually, we realize that our difficulties have the potential to help us create a greater life. An emerging purpose impels us forward, opening to fresh opportunities. We meet new people. Life becomes a gift. There are no guarantees of ease. Yet when we see from a higher perspective, we perceive the stream of light that connects all of humanity. Every person experiences thrilling and horrific moments. When we understand this similarity, we feel a deep connection that erases the loneliness and instead offers an uplifting unity. This is joy. Mom, it seems unfathomable that you left me 32 years ago. My path to healing has been long and arduous. Letter writing has been key for me. I now know for sure that you are always there urging me onward, and for this I am deeply grateful. Love, Helen.
That's
So
amazing.
thank you. I feel like it really sums up grief, and that it's so important that we really acknowledge that we carry grief. So I'll just tell you a little bit about my own story, because for me, it's actually filled with miracles, miracles that I kind of had to see when I looked back upon it, but there are many miracles. So as I said on my earlier podcast, my mother died very suddenly when I was only 40. Then my second child was born when I was 41. So I had the perfect excuse. I literally just kept busy. That's exactly what my mother did after my father died. She just kept very busy. And that was my mom. So that's what I did. And then, of course, I fell apart. And then that's really when the magic started. I remember that the first thing that happened was that a few months after I got out of the hospital, my family and I drove down to Portsmouth and went to Barnes and Noble. And by this time, I thought to myself, okay, this is not normal for a 40-year-old person. I need to find some help. So I went to the Get Help section. And I was literally just standing there when a book about angels fell at my feet. And so I picked it up and I started looking at it, and I knew immediately that that was my next step. So I started looking around to find somebody who taught anything about the angels. And I found this woman in New Hampshire. And I remember after I found her and connected with her and signed up for one of her courses, I remember seeing a friend who knew that I was interested in the angels. And I said, oh my gosh, Denise, I'm so excited. I found somebody. Her name is Elizabeth Foley. And Denise looked at me and she said, Helen, I told you about her a month ago. I had no clue whatsoever, but it was such a reminder as I look back at it that we can hear many things that are to be our next step. But if we're not quite ready, we don't hear it yet, but it will come back to us in some way to remind us. So I started studying angels. I've studied for many years. It's just been such a glorious study in my life about angels and archangels, ascended masters, and the seraphim angels. In particular, those are the ones that I've mostly studied. I, of course, work with the angels every day, and I am very, very, very grateful for their presence in my life. When I talk about angels in this aspect, I'm actually talking about the beings who vibrate at a higher dimension, not the people from our past, who we also consider to be angels. And then, because I had taught Spanish for many years, and I have a master's in Spanish, but I felt like there was something else I was supposed to do. So for 5 years, I would just Google and find out about intuitives totally around the country. I only knew one of them. The rest were all people I didn't know, but I would just, pay through PayPal, and I would get an hour reading it with each one of these people. And the strangest thing happened. Every single one of these people told me I was going to write a book. And I was horrified. I thought, what can I write about? I'm a Spanish teacher. I don't want to write a textbook about Spanish. I mean, I love Spanish, but I didn't want to write a textbook about it. And finally, someone said, no, 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 no. This has to do with your mother, and it has to do with emotions. And I was like, okay. And then my daughter and I were very close, and my daughter moved out to California to study Waldorf education. So I sort of had this gap in my schedule now. And I thought, okay, well, if I'm supposed to write a book, I guess I better find out a little bit more about it. And this was another one of those miracles that came about. My daughter moved all the way across country to California. And the first day that she got there, she got this email. And she said, Mom, I think this email is from you. I don't even know who this person is. And so she sent it to me, and I opened it up, and it was about writing a book. And it was from Gay Hendricks. Neither of us had ever heard about Gay Hendricks, but I learned later that he had written 31 books. And then he was going to start a whole series of courses about how to write and publish a book. He only did it once, and I was in that class. And after the first class, of course, the assignment was to figure out what we were going to write. And I was completely clueless. I have a room where I meditate in my house. And I remember before going into meditation that morning, I literally threw up my hands and I just said, I have no idea. And the idea was instantly right there. Instantly. It was write letters to your mother. And I was like, oh, I could do that. I spent an entire lifetime writing letters to my mother. I've since thought about that. And I may be the only person that you will ever meet who can claim this. But from the time I was 18 until 68, so we're talking about 50 years, I wrote weekly letters to my family because that's what we did. So that's a lot of letters. So I felt pretty confident I could write some letters to my mother. So I started on this journey. I had no idea how it was going to come along. I had no idea what it was about, but all I knew is that every now and then I would start to hear the beginning of a letter, and I would just have to grab a notebook and start writing. Oftentimes it was in the middle of the night, or it could be when I was in the shower. It could be any time. But it was always a very deep connection with my mother, just really talking about my own grief, something that I would never have talked about with anyone else. And I would often just sob through the entire letter, which, when I look back on it, I realized was very healing for me. I didn't come from a background where we dealt with grief at all. My parents both lived through the Depression and through World War II. And I think their philosophy on life based on that was life is tough. You have to look for the good, be of service, and just keep moving forward. That was it. People die and you just keep moving forward. So it was hard for me really to allow myself to be so open to the grief, because I certainly did not grow up with that belief. But it felt so right to write these letters. And in the letters, I talk about all sorts of grief. So, of course, a lot is about the death of my mother, the shock, the trauma of losing her so suddenly when I was so young, but also going back to the rather sudden death for me of my Uncle Stan, who lived with us, who was like a grandfather to me, and to my father, because I was only 26 when he died, and he also died suddenly. So it was a wonderful opportunity. And I found that I wrote also about, for example, my college roommate's husband had died of cancer after a very long 2-year battle. And so I wrote about that because my mother knew my college roommate. I wrote about, I'm sure you'll remember, when Stacey Burns was murdered in her own home here in Wolfboro a number of years ago. And I wrote about that. And I wrote about going to funerals and how funerals let us process each time a little bit more. And I wrote about actually becoming an empty nester when my son went off to college, because that's loss. So I wrote about a lot of different kind of losses. What I noticed was that every time after I wrote a letter, I would reread it to myself. And I noticed that the letters all ended in the same way. They more or less said, "Thank you, Mom. I still need you. Please stay by my side. Love, Helen." And then 8 years later, I mean, as I say, I never had any clue how this was going to end. 8 years later, it was Mother's Day, and I thought, oh my gosh, I have to write a letter to my mom. I haven't written for a while. So I sat down and I wrote a letter to my mother, and it ended in a different way. And I immediately knew I had just finished my book. So then we were actually about to go back off to Spain in a few weeks. And I talked to a friend of mine, and she said, "Oh, Helen, this woman and I, she's in marketing, and I bet she would just give you a free session." So I was like, okay. So she gave me a free session. And we squeezed it in before I left. And she said, "So do you have an epilogue and a prologue?" And I said, "Nope." She said, "All right, that's your next step." So I just packed my notebook into my suitcase and we got to Spain and we were spending a week on the coast. So the first day we got there, and then, it was like 3:30 in the afternoon. It was siesta time for everyone, including my husband, but definitely not for me. And suddenly I could hear the epilogue and the prologue. I just had to write really fast, and there was the rest of my book. I had the epilogue and the prologue. And then for many years, I just kept following whatever I heard, whether it was about marketing or teaching online or publishing. I knew I had a very deep sense from the beginning that I wanted to work with Balboa Press because Balboa Press is the publisher, the self-publishing unit of Hay House. And I always felt that my book would be a good Hay House book. So I wanted to sort of weave it into that area. So anyway, it's just been a very long but just amazing journey. And I feel like even the things that have happened to me, even the recent things, you may or may not know that I recently was down by dockside actually in the middle of July when my toe got stuck under the picnic table and I splatted on the cement, breaking my right wrist and my left elbow. And then, as if that weren't enough, the left elbow, when I was very close to being healed by everything, they determined that the left elbow was not properly healing. So I had to have another surgery on that. But I have actually realized that there was a purpose for every one of those things and for all of the other things that have happened in my life. So I think my deepest hope with all of this is really letting people know that it's important to grieve, that when we hold all those emotions inside, we don't know really the damage that we're doing to our bodies. Whether it was in my case of fracturing my back and having pneumonia or whatever the illness may be. I'm certainly not saying that all illness is because of grief, but I am saying that there is such a strong body-mind connection that when we don't pay attention to our emotions, that something will manifest because our emotions are there to guide us. And when we ignore our emotions, they will come back to yell at us in some way. So anyway, I'm just very excited that finally this book is coming out into the world. I've started a free motherless daughter gathering, and we had our first session in October. And the information is always published on my Facebook page, just under Helen Fernald. And we will meet again in October on the third Friday of every month from 11 to 12, again in October and November, certainly nothing in December. But it was that we had a beautiful sharing of our own experiences and we were able to talk about grief. And I was so grateful to be able to have that opportunity to share with other people. And I'm so grateful to have this opportunity. So I'm wondering if you have any questions for me.
Well, I just want to say thank you for sharing this information and for being vulnerable to express your grief. I think one of the major reasons that me and Laurie even started this podcast was to make conversations that aren't normal. And
Yes,
I think that we don't discuss grief, right? I think that I don't believe that there's a guideline for grief, and we're not taught how to grieve, not healthy, not laugh because nobody before us knew how. They weren't taught. There was no guidebook to it, and people don't want to talk about it or they don't want to hear about it. It's sad. It's, and so it's not a conversation that people have. And I think that it's very important that it needs to become a conversation because there is nobody who isn't touched by it in some form or another. So it needs to become normalized to be able to talk about it. And I just thank you so much for being a part of that movement and to help make this conversation a normal conversation so that I think grief is very, very personal. It looks different for everybody. But if we have these conversations, we can help heal just by holding space to hear out somebody else. And I just thank you so much for your book and for having the courage to do that.
Thank you. Well, I really appreciate those comments, and I think you are absolutely right about that. I think it's very hard for us to be so intimate in our culture. And there's also kind of this underlying piece that says, oh, we should all be cheerful and happy and just say all of our myriad affirmations and things. And heaven only knows, I am certainly a cheerful person, actually. But I also agree that we have to allow ourselves to balance all of it, because there is no really terrible or good emotion. It's all just part of being human. And when we express it in a healthy way, then it doesn't get jammed up and come out as anger and rage and rude comments and complaints and all sorts of things like that, that we see so much in violence, really, that comes from our culture. We think particularly, I feel like COVID, of course, was a really challenging period for everyone. And, we lost that community, we lost the connection. But COVID was also about loss of family, about loss of health, but also about loss of community and opportunities and the opportunity to share. And so I think that's why I think it's so important. I always, when I learn that someone has lost someone, my first suggestion is always to either find a counselor or to find a grief group, because I think it's so important to make that connection. I was just extraordinarily lucky. I remember that as I began to recover from being in the hospital, I went to my pastor and he said, oh, I could connect you with Joan Lovering. Anybody older like me that's listening to this probably knows who Joan Lovering was. She was very active in the community for many years, and she worked with hospice. And I got started on that. And then I worked with Mimi Dye and with Wanda Harris and with another woman who was down in Dover. And I really don't know what I would have done without those people. They were just all so helpful. And I know that there are many, many grief groups also. Now, of course, there are online grief groups. So that's one of the things actually one of the things that I bring to my gathering for motherless daughters, for I Miss You Mom gatherings, is a whole 2-page list of resources of therapists and online groups and all sorts of resources, because there are resources available, but we're just not particularly aware of them. So I think that that's so important. And the other thing that I would like to say about letter writing, now we all know that, people have written letters for millennium. And I did find this kind of funny. I was listening to actually a TED Talk about writing letters. And I learned on this TED Talk that the ancient Egyptians, of course, most of them did not write. So they would actually have to pay for someone to write a letter. And they would go to someone and they would ask the person to write a letter to the person who had died. But as opposed to my letters, I just thought this was so funny. The whole purpose of their writing a letter was to say to the person who had died, I did this for you in your life. So now on the other side, you have to do this for me. So it was a very different perspective. My letters are really just as if I could because I couldn't sit at the kitchen table, then I would write these letters as though I was just having a normal conversation at the table or by phone with my mother. And that became such an extraordinary gift to me. It all came to me. I understand that therapists often recommend that to people, but I didn't know that when I started letter writing. But what I realized through writing letters for those 8 years, and I'm not suggesting that people have to write for that long, but what I learned was that I actually had this extraordinary reconnection with my mother. I grew up with a wonderful mother. I know she loved me. I loved her. But the bottom line is that my mother was very busy. She had a lot of people to take care of, and she also worked. So I didn't really see my mother very often. And I mean, I saw her coming and going, but it's not like, we sat down at the kitchen table and discussed, death or, boyfriends or anything. She was just very busy. And so when I started writing letters to my mother, it was this amazing opportunity that I had to actually converse with her. And that was such an extraordinary gift, because I realized by the time I finished those letters that I felt very close to my mother. And the other thing that I understood, as I said in the letter that I read earlier, I had a great sense of self-compassion. And once we have self-compassion, we have compassion to everyone. And I developed this extraordinary sense of compassion for my mother because as I wrote those letters, I began to see what her life was like and why she was so busy. And she didn't have a choice, and all that she did for me. And it was really this beautiful reconnection with my mother. And I think that that is the gift of actually writing letters. I recently met a young friend, and she had lost a friend. And so I said to her, "Oh, you could write letters." "Oh, yes, yes, yes. I've sent emails and I've sent texts." But I was like, "No, no, 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 that does not help." It's actually the physical writing of letters that allows the emotions, and there is certainly research around this, the physical writing of letters so that the energy from your heart, because the energy from your heart comes right out your hands, right out your arms and your hands. When you write a letter, it actually, the emotion can come through you and it comes to the other person. And it also can be very healing for you because you're able to release a lot of those emotions. So there is great value. I know that we have lost so much of the art of letter writing in today's world, and I get it. Because it's so easy to send a text or so quick to send an email. And we're used to a very fast world, a very instantaneous gratification, as they say. But the truth of the matter is that there's nothing like writing letters to someone, whether they're still here on Earth or whether they've gone beyond. It's a very, very powerful and very therapeutic way to heal whatever I think we're dealing with.
I
So
agree.
yeah,
Really,
yeah.
my writing letters to my grandmother for until she was 97. And
Wow.
now I am continuing that writing with my adult niece.
Yes,
Um, and we're just having a wonderful time. And you can save the letters. They're not going to be deleted. You know,
yes, exactly.
she
Yes.
draws pictures. It's just wonderful. Really, really nice.
I totally agree with that. I have 100-year-old um, aunt Helen in that lives in Portland, Maine, that I see from time to time. But yes, I send her letters, and because it's so fun to get a letter. And how often do we actually get letters in the mail? We usually get bills and ads and everything else, but hardly ever one of those letters. And it's so interesting because just 3 days after I got the word that my brother had died unexpectedly, I got a letter from him, just as if nothing were wrong. And I am quite sure that somebody in that house found a letter that he had not opened that was delivered to him after his own death. So it really is lovely. And I have some very young nieces that I like to write to because I think it's so fun to get something in the mail in today's world. So I am hoping that by some tiny way that maybe I will encourage people to write letters again because it's not only therapeutic, but I think it just brings joy. It brings joy to the other person, but I think it also brings joy to us. And because it's a connection that we have. So it's so important, I think. So
I have a question for you. You were mentioning that you were discovering more about your mother. Do you feel her around you? I mean, you feel her presence?
I do. I've had some amazing dreams and some amazing visions. Now, my mother died. My mother had a massive heart attack when she was at an opening exhibit at the Cleveland Art Museum, which just always seemed like the perfect place for my mother to have a heart attack. She was right around the corner from the university hospital, so they immediately took her to the hospitals. My brother came. They said, "Oh, your mother's going to be just fine." So my brother, spoke with my mother and then went home. And then my mother at 3 o'clock that morning died very suddenly from a massive heart attack. And I was working with one of my counselors. I work actually now with an online counselor. And I was working with one of my counselors for whatever reason we were dealing with my mother, but not about her death in particularly. That's why this whole thing was such a total surprise. All of a sudden, I was sitting there, and I often work when I'm doing something online with my eyes closed. And all of a sudden, I had the most beautiful image. I saw my mother in a dark room, which would have been her hospital room at 3 o'clock in the morning. Exactly nearly to the day, 1 year before her older sister had died. Her older sister was like a mother to my mother. They were very close all of their lives. I think that's why my mother survived widowhood for 14 years, because she had her sister there. Her sister was her main support. But then her sister died, and my mother lasted for one more year. And this thought had never crossed my mind, but I was sitting there, I just with my eyes closed, and I could see my mother. And all of a sudden, I just saw my Aunt Betty come in this extraordinary light and just take my mother's hand, and off they went. And it was so beautiful. Now, maybe it was my imagination. I don't know, but I certainly the thought had never crossed my mind. So I like to think of it as something beautiful that really happened. And this was one of the most moving moments that I have. This was about a year ago. I was working on something, and all of a sudden, oh no, no, this was a dream. This was a dream. It was one of the most beautiful dreams I've ever had. It was at night. The dream was at night. And I have trouble seeing at night for night driving, so I avoid that. But somehow I'd gotten to this place during the day, and it was time to leave. I had to get home. I was all by myself, and it was pitch black. I mean, pitch black, but I had no choice. Besides, we know how these dreams are. It turns out that I didn't really know how I was going to get where I was going. I wasn't really sure of the route. All I knew was that I had to drive along this very, very, very narrow mountain road. And it was one of those mountain roads that, you look down and it's sheer drop off. So I'm in the car, very nervous, driving along. And all of a sudden, I looked to the driver's seat, and there was my mother, completely lit up. And in that moment, in that dream, I knew immediately that I would be okay, that I would get where I was going. So it was really beautiful. I actually there are a number of dreams that I talk about in my book. Obviously, my book is not all the letters that I wrote during 8 years. I will be very specific about that, because people would be like, I don't want to read that. So, but it was interesting as I was getting ready to prepare the manuscript. It's funny because in my mind, I had been working on this project for so long. And then it was really last spring that I even had a contract with a publishing company. And then suddenly last spring, I realized that I was always talking about the book. And I suddenly thought, oh my goodness, I do not have a complete manuscript. I have hundreds of letters, many of them typed up, but many other ones just in notebooks. I don't have a manuscript written. So that became my process for last spring. And it was probably a little bit like driving along that road. But anyway, I kept hearing in my head the number 40. And finally, I was talking to a friend, and I said, okay, I keep hearing the number 40 when I think about my book. And she said, well, Helen, let's face it, that's a very spiritual number. You think about Jesus, 40 days in the desert. You think about 40 days on the ark. And I was like, oh, I'm supposed to put in 40 letters. So that made it much easier. So my book is actually, I think in the editing process, it got down to 39 letters. But anyway, it's 39 letters. And there are several poems, because also during that time, I think whatever we're supposed to do, if we are really following our intuition and on the right path, I think that the world just opens up to us. And I, who am not a poet, my brother was a great poet. I am not a poet. During those 8 years, I just got these extraordinary poems, beautiful poems, poems about grief, poems about healing, poems about the burning rage in my soul, poems about cleaning out the closet of my soul, these extraordinary poems. I think there are 4 or 5 of those poems in the book. I also, in the book, I have the last birthday card that I received from my mother in 1992. So it's a little hard to read, but I just wanted to include it because it shows my mother's handwriting. And she ends the letter by saying something so beautiful. She ends the letter by saying, you have always been here for me. I hope I can always be there for you. And then she just died a few months later. And I've thought to myself, as I put together the book, I thought, wow, she really always has been here. So there are several dreams that I talk about in the book also where my mother has come. And yes, so I'm very grateful for that deep connection that I feel. But I also think again that when we go through this process, when we allow ourselves to grieve, we also allow others to grieve, and we allow them in their own way to reconnect. And I have a friend who lost her husband a year ago from cancer, and it was a very challenging 4 years. And I know that grieving has been very hard for her. And she, bless her heart, has worked with counselors, and she's worked with a grief group. But I think that the best thing that I can do is just be there for her and just listen and just kind of cheer her on and say, yes, grief is real. Yes, yes. And you are doing a good job at grieving. Yes. And I think that we need more of that kind of support for people who are grieving. We tend in this culture to say something like, oh, it was such a blessing. And it's true. It usually is. In the case of my mother, she did not want to end her life in a slow death. So she just zipped right out. And that was a blessing. And I focused on that. I have always focused on that and been extraordinarily grateful for that. But that doesn't mean it was a blessing for me. And that doesn't, and we really can't say those things to other people because we have not lived in their shoes. We don't know what they're really going through or what the circumstances are, even if they're our best friends. So I think that it is so important to be cautious about what we say to others about grief, and just to really recognize. I had no idea about this, but I discovered that I believe it's the 30th of August is actually National Grief Awareness Day. And so I did have a small article in the local newspaper in the Granite State for that week. And I also talked with someone from the Manchester Union Leader, and we had a wonderful conversation. I have to tell you that I was so impressed because she spent 45 minutes on the phone talking with me about my own experience, my own grief. And then she did quote me a little bit in the article, for which I felt very honored. But I thought it was so beautiful. It was on the front page a few weeks ago of the Sunday Manchester Union Leader in the New Hampshire section. And I just thought it was so beautiful that she was willing to write about grief. And she consulted at great length, I think, also with a hospice worker. So there was a lot about that. And there was just a lot of information to help people, which I thought was really beautiful. So I do think that we are moving into a time, I hope that we are moving into a time where we can feel we can be more authentic with all of our feelings, because when we can be authentic with ourselves, it just gives us such a deeper understanding of other people and what they go through. And as I say, we all know that we all have our challenges. None of us gets through this life without challenges. None of us gets through this life without heartache and loss. None of us. And if we can see that as such a uniting piece, then in some way, it is my deep hope that we can help each other with that.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And I totally agree with you. I think that just being together with someone, I think that we have a tendency of wanting to fix something, or we're just so uncomfortable with sitting with somebody else who's going through it, that we want to say the right words, or we want to fix them. We want to, get them out of that grief. And if we learn to just be comfortable with sitting with them. I tell you my own experience. When my mother passed away 22 years ago, I actually was really angry at everybody who had something to say to me.
Yes.
I found it, and I knew it was ridiculous. I knew that these people were doing it from a loving place. I knew that they were trying to help me. And yet every time they would say, your mother meant so much to me, or your mother was so great to me, or they would say anything, and it would make me so angry because they were talking about their grief and my mother, and I would get angry because it was my mother. You think you're sad? You think it was wonderful? She's my mother. And it wasn't rational at all.
No. But you know what? I am so glad that you are talking about this, because we all, there's the Ross what is the person who studied about grief and has the different stages of grief. I'm sorry, I can't remember her name right at the moment. But we all know that anger is such a key piece of grief. And yet we're not supposed to express that. And if we're not supposed to express that, then exactly what you're saying is exactly what happens. It gets all stuffed inside. And then people, even who are meaning well, that I totally hear you on that one. And I remember for me, I think the hardest thing in one of the letters I write about my anger, and I say, Mom, I think the hardest thing for me to have dealt with was the anger that I had to you. I never felt I had a right to be angry with you, even though you were busy, because you were such a good person and everybody loved you. And how could I possibly be angry? But a little child is honest with her feelings, and we all have little children inside of us. And I think that that's your point is so well taken about anger, because there's so much anger in our society right now, so much anger. And I think it's in part because we don't allow ourselves to be honest with other people. And so I really appreciate you bringing that up, because anger is a hard one, especially in this culture, and especially for women. Men can get angry, but women are technically not supposed to get angry. We're just supposed to smile and move right on and suck it up. And we can't, because we are human beings also. So thank you. I think that's a really good point. Very, very important.
And I think that this stuff helps, these conversations help people realize, and that we have to learn as a society to be able to sit with people in uncomfortable feelings, the anger, the sadness, that it's okay to just sit with somebody and acknowledge their feeling,
Yes.
and that uncomfortable feelings are okay. And if we can find someone to sit with us through that, we can help process it and get past it. Because if we don't, if somebody, just wants to tell us a certain thing or move on past it, right? We haven't done anything with that anger. We haven't expressed it. We haven't healed it. We haven't been able to move past it. We're now holding on to it and getting angrier because somebody sat with us who didn't know how. Not that it's their fault they didn't know how to sit with us, because nobody teaches us that we don't know how to do this. No, we all have to learn together to be able to just sit with people, to let them be able to express it with no judgment on it being right or wrong or rational or not rational, so that they can work through it and move past it instead of holding on it and then it festering. And that's kind of what we know how to do, right? We want to either fix people or get away from the uncomfortable feeling, and then that just festers more in everybody. So I think these conversations are so important, and to acknowledge that none of us really know how to do it. So we're all learning together, but unless we have these conversations, unless we try something new, we won't learn how to do it.
Exactly. And again, it's that, just as you pointed out, it's the fact that it unites us all. It brings us together, actually, to have conversations. It's something that we all share. And we all share all of the range of emotions. I am telling you, when I was listening to that poetry come to me, some of those poems were so powerful about anger. And as I said, it's this burning lava inside of me. I had no idea I had burning lava inside me, but I could see that that's the anger. That's the anger, because there's a part of us, there's a little child part of us that still feels like when we lose somebody, and I don't think it really makes any difference. I think it's always traumatic when we lose somebody, because even if we've been with that person through illness, that last moment is traumatic. And I think that we all in some way feel like that little child who just didn't get enough time. It doesn't matter whether it's 80 years or 10 years or whatever, that we just wanted a little more time, and that we were robbed of something, or we were abandoned. And it's just the little child in us, but it makes so much sense. And I think it's so important that we honor all of that.
My mom passed away this year, and I miss her every day. And my dad a year to the day that she passed. But the thing I want to say was that when we experience grief, then we do have that ability to sit with someone as far as understanding what they're going through. And I'm really shocked, actually, at how much grief there is. I've recently heard so many people talk about sharing about what's happened in their life or what they've, who they've lost. And it's really prevalent. And I didn't really pay attention before as much as I now that I've, gone through my own grieving. I'm still going through it. You're aware, and you connect a little bit better with someone else. I think you can have a little bit more ability to sit, as Laura was saying, with somebody else in that space.
And I'm so sorry because I think that those two losses so close together must have been very, very challenging for you. So I'm very sorry for your loss. But it's beautiful that you've been able to talk about it a little bit and share it a little bit. And I think really that is the key to healing. I remember that after I fractured my back and was home from the hospital, a friend came to visit. And this was an introduction when she came. This was an introduction for me of the incredible body, mind, spirit. And she said to me, Helen, the spine is your support system. When your mother died, you lost your support. And I thought, wow, that's so true. And then she said, and anything with the lungs, and I know this is also very true in Chinese medicine. She said, anything with the lungs, whether it's pneumonia or tuberculosis or bronchitis or whatever, anything to do with the lungs is grief. And I thought, wow. That was really my first introduction, and that was so helpful to me to be able to see how things are so related when we and what potentially could happen to us when we don't express our feelings. So it's really remarkable how our bodies talk to us and how we really need to listen, but how we need to listen to other people also to help them as well, I think. So I think these are just beautiful points that you're making. I really appreciate that. Thank you.
We appreciate you, Helen, for sharing, and let our listeners know too how they can get a copy of your book.
Thank you. I will have information. My website is just helenfernald.com, and I will have all the information on my website. I'm really hoping in a week or two. So, and I will also have the information in the local newspaper and also on my website about, and certainly social media, about the book signing in the country bookstore, because I love the country bookseller here in Wolfboro, and I'm excited. And I've already talked to Autumn, and she's happy to do this. So I'm very excited about being able to do a book signing there in case anybody would actually like a copy. So
that's great. And when you get the Amazon link, we will definitely post that on our Next Perfect Step Facebook page so people can find your book if they're not close to Wolfboro to go up and see. So we will definitely do that.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. That is so kind. I do feel like I have felt from the start of this 25 years ago that there is a purpose to this. And I do feel like the book, whenever I've read letters to anybody, people, I belonged to that was actually one of the other miracles that happened to me, was that just as I began to write these letters out of the blue, I was on the post office steps here in Wolfboro, and a friend of mine came out of the Wolfboro post office, and I mean, I don't even think I talked to anybody about really writing these letters. And she came up to me and she said, Helen, I'm starting a writing group. Would you like to belong? I was like, well, sure. So that was really fabulous, because then, I would go and I would have these letters, and then I would make sure I would type one up before I went so we could review it. But what was always fascinating to me was that we would get in this group and, people would share, and we would all talk about, oh, maybe you could change this word or maybe put a period there, whatever it was. And then I would read my letters, and all of a sudden everybody would start talking about their mothers. It was so amazing. I thought, okay, these letters, people really connect with these letters. And then I got invited to another book group. So I went and I shared a letter of mine. And then the husband of one of the women came out. Now, he was probably in his 80s at the time. And she said, oh, honey, you just have to listen to this letter. And kind of inside, I thought, oh, God, he is really not going to be into this. But okay, I just have to be brave. So I smiled and I started reading. Oh, my goodness. This man listened so intently, and at the end of the conversation, he whipped out his wallet. Now, he's in his 80s. His mother had already passed. He whips out his wallet. He starts showing me pictures of his mother and talking about his mother. It was so beautiful. I was so moved that even this older gentleman was drawn in by the letters. So I feel like I was guided with the letters. And so I'm just truly hoping that this book can bring healing to other people. That is my greatest wish. So, and again, I'm just so grateful for this opportunity to come back and talk about all these things that are so close to my heart. So, and you just had such beautiful questions and comments as you always do. So, and I totally appreciate that one of your missions is to bring these conversations to light that we don't often get. So thank you so much for the way that you help to heal the world. I think it's beautiful also. So I feel very grateful. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. And if you liked this conversation, please like, share, and subscribe to our page. And until next time, how is your intuition leading you to the next perfect step?